Hello, good morning, everybody. I'm Liz Hume, and I'm the Executive Director at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and we are so excited that you are all here. I can see there's a lot of people online. So let me just get right to it because there's so much incredible information here. This is the launch of the annual Global Terrorism Index, the GTI, and it's an annual comprehensive study on global terrorism. Why is this so important? Because as everybody knows and has heard me say 1,000 times, data and good analysis and data is what advances and strengthens our field. But for these types of reports from the Institute of Economics for Peace and many of our other members and partners, we would not be where we are today in terms of advocating and making the case for peace building and conflict prevention. So I can't tell you how important this data is and this analysis is. And I am grateful that we have partners like the Institute for Economics for Peace that is doing this work. So I'm going to turn it over because there's so much in this report that is so critical to our work in terms of making the case for it, where we should be programming, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to just turn it over to my dear friend, Michael Collins, who is the the America's executive director at the Institute for Economics for Peace. So Michael, take it away. And then I'll moderate the discussion. And just really quickly, we have two other incredible speakers that, will you be introducing them?
I think.
Oh, okay, I'll introduce them when they're, so Dr. Benjamin Paul, the head of climate, diplomacy and security program from Adelphi. They do incredible work on climate change data. And Dr. Bakri Samba, regional director from the Timbuktu Institute. If I did not say your names correctly, please correct me when you're introducing yourself. So thank you so much. Take it away, Michael.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Liz, and welcome everyone. Very quickly about the work of the Institute. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and we're dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, tangible, and achievable measure of human well-being and progress. One of our flagship reports, or our flagship report, is the Global Peace Index, which measures peacefulness across 163 countries in the world. Within that incorporates a number of kind of sort of indicators related to violence and conflict, so things like homicide, conflict, levels of militarization, and also importantly, the impact of terrorism as well. And the impact of terrorism is kind of sort of an interesting beast in a sense, because, you know, in many ways, overall, when looked at globally, the people who die from terrorism are significantly less than the people who die from conflict, right? 9 times less people die from terrorism than from conflict, and 45 times less than the people that die from homicide. And even less when it comes to people who commit suicide, for example. So, you know, in the whole realm of violence, terrorism only sort of represents a small part of that, but invariably, perhaps because of its nature, also has a significant social and geopolitical impact as well. So being able to sort of understand some of those underlying dynamics is key to be able to not only address terrorism, but also a lot of the broader socioeconomic components as well. The way that sort of we try and you know, sort of establish and measure the changing trends in the impact of terrorism, again, recognizing this long-term sort of social and geopolitical impact that it can have, is to, number one, measure incidents and deaths and instances of hostages and injuries, for example, related to terrorism, but also tracking it over a period of 5 years and giving it a weight over that time in sort of a quantitative attempt to be able to understand the social impact that it has in countries around the world, and of course, which countries are most impacted by terrorism. So that forms the basis of the Global Terrorism Index that we're going to be talking about today. Now, there's no universal definition of terrorism, and of course, it's sort of hotly debated. So I wanted to put up front and center here the definition that we use for terrorism. In this case, the systematic threat or use of violence by non-state actors, whether for or against or in opposition to established authority, with the intention of communicating political, religious, or ideological message to a group larger than the victim group, to create fear, and so altering or attempting to alter the behavior of the larger group. So it doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue, but it is important to kind of sort of create guardrails around the overall definition. So things that it doesn't include specifically as it pertains to the global terrorism are instances of terror by a state actor, for example, whether that's repression or an attack on another country, for example. Those are measures that would be included in the Global Peace Index, but not in the Global Terrorism Index. So jumping straight into the overall findings related to terrorism this year. So we have seen an increase in overall deaths from terrorism in 2023, 22% to be specific. The main driver of that was essentially the Hamas attack in Israel on October 7th, accounting for 1,200 deaths overall. But taking that individual attack out, we still saw an increase in deaths related to terrorism last year of 5%. What we did see, however, though, is an overall decrease in the number of attacks. So a large percentage of attacks, terrorist attacks around the world have no fatalities. 96% from memory of terrorist attacks have on average less than 10 fatalities specifically. So it's a very small amount of attacks that account for the overall death toll. So if we think about the number of attacks decreasing, but the number of deaths increasing, as well as the fact that actually the overall number of countries that have either suffered an attack or a death over the last year has reduced as well. So this is the fewest countries that have had a terrorist attack since we started counting it in 2007. All of this sort of translates into what we call this increase in lethality, right? So there are less terrorist attacks. They're perpetrated by less groups, but they are overall more deadly. And sort of talking about compression or basically consolidation of terrorism around the world, 5 countries, as you can see here, account for the bulk of terrorism worldwide. So as you can see on the right-hand side, Burkina Faso actually accounted for 700 more deaths. Let me just get this out of the way here. 700 more deaths than the ones we saw in Israel this year. Although it is, of course, spread out over 2023, whereas the case of Israel was primarily, if not entirely, due to a single attack. Countries like Mali, Pakistan, and Syria also the most impacted overall. A slight improvement in the number of deaths in Mali, and slight deterioration in Pakistan, and deterioration in Syria as well. But on the bottom there, you can obviously see the rest of the world, and we see an overall improvement or a reduction in the number of deaths globally speaking. But as you can see, those 5 countries account for pretty much, well, 60% of all terrorist attacks worldwide. So this is the spread of the 10 countries with the highest number of deaths in 2023. We did just discuss Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso has, is very much the flag bearer of terrorism around the world. And we're going to be delving into sort of the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa a bit more broadly. But the case of Burkina Faso is quite exceptional in the sense that terrorism has been consistently, going up quite significantly in Burkina Faso for the last, 5 to 7 years, if not more. The case of Israel in this instance, again, is kind of sort of largely related to the single events that we see here. But as you can see, the top 10 countries accounting for almost 90% of all terrorism deaths worldwide. So in terms of the countries most impacted by terrorism, and again, this is going back to not only last year, but also all attacks and deaths over the last 5 years as well. This is the first time that neither Iraq or Syria have been kind of sort of ranked the worst when it comes to terrorism worldwide. That place is now occupied by Burkina Faso, and then followed by Israel. In the case of Mali, which is coming in third, we actually saw a slight improvement in terrorism last year, but due to the significant deteriorations in Israel and Burkina Faso specifically, it actually moved relatively little in the overall ranking. In Afghanistan and Somalia, the ones where we'd sort of see an improved ranking, for lack of a better word here. One of the reasons is because last year we already reported that the Taliban, according to the definition that we looked at before, is no longer considered a terrorist organization because they are the de facto government of Afghanistan, whether that is something that we would agree with or not. And in the case of Somalia, one of the things that we've been seeing is this, at least temporary success of a lot of the counterterrorism measures happening there right now with AU and AU peacekeeping forces there supported by the US. So this is in terms of the overall increase in individual countries that we would have seen. Again, Israel massively affected by the singular terrorist Hamas strike on October 7th. Burkina Faso, a significant increase, but again, building on a very high base. And other countries that are no strangers to terrorism, Niger, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Syria, to name just a few. In the case of Cameroon, an increase in deaths this year, that's unfortunate and of course worrying because I think it had been improving for the last 3 years, essentially. And the same can be said for Colombia, that had been improving for the last couple of years now, and a significant uptick in measures of terrorism there, largely in relation to the FARC and the ELN. And then lastly, Uganda, that hasn't seen a whole lot of terrorism historically, saw 2 or 3 attacks from memory last year. One of those accounted for most of the deaths that you see here. In terms of overall decreases, well, we can see this sort of very significant decrease in Afghanistan for the reasons that I described before. In the index, this is the first time that Afghanistan has accounted for less than 500 deaths per year. An improvement in Somalia, again, mentioning some of the counterterrorism measures ongoing there, although at the tail end of last year, there was a significant attack that I think is making them think twice about potentially relieving some of the peacekeeping operations there. An improvement in Mali, but in this instance, Mali continues to have high levels of terrorism overall. And one of the things that we've seen in Iraq is probably the opposite to what we see in Burkina Faso, which is this gradual and consistent, at least until now, improvement in measures of terrorism in that specific country. So here's a map of all of the terrorist attacks that we would have seen in 2023. Again, we can kind of sort of see the impact of the terrorist attack by Hamas in Israel in terms of overall size. And again, this map kind of sort of allows us to see the concentration, that's the word that I was looking for before, of terrorism around the world. And one of the things that we've already been reporting on for a couple of years, but is truly solidified now, of course, is the move of the epicenter of terrorism from the Middle Eastern region, despite the attack in Israel and ongoing instability, to sub-Saharan Africa, and more specifically, the Sahel, and even more specifically, Burkina Faso, and Mali and Niger. This is a distribution of terrorism, and one of the things that I wanted to note here is on the left-hand side, you'll sort of see this half bell curve, essentially, which sort of, talks about the average size, essentially, of a terrorist attack around the world. Again, most of the terrorist incidents don't have a fatality, and the very large percentage of those have less than 10. There are, of course, considerably larger terrorist attacks than that. And in that sort of particular curve, an outlier, like what we would have seen in Israel with over 1,000 people killed is, of course, rare, but it's not exceptional either. It does happen when we look at it from a global perspective. But as you can see, if we look at it on the right-hand side here from a country perspective, so this is Burkina Faso and Israel. And as you can see, the curve is generally quite similar. But an attack like that at a country level is truly, truly exceptional in many ways. So in terms of the overall impact of terrorism, and delving into sort of some of my initial comments, about the social impact and the geopolitical one, well, just to take one, and namely the major terrorist attack this year, an estimated 30,000 Palestinians have been killed by the response to that terrorist attack in terms of overall social impact, just to give you one example. But also from a geopolitical perspective, not only has it created significantly more instability within the region, with a likely increase in terrorism over the next year, but also in terms of a potential, two-state solution in Israel and Palestine, at least in relation to, in this instance, what people in Israel would perceive. So this is a Gallup World Poll issued in Israel, and it went from about 60% of people believing that a two-state solution was possible to less than 20%. So in terms of overall trends. And this is looking at the sort of 3 regions around the world that have been most impacted by terrorism historically. In yellow, you can see the MENA region, and those sort of 2 large spikes that you see in there in the middle are essentially the consequences of, well, a number of things: the war on terror, also the Arab Spring, and the rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria primarily. There has been a significant improvement in the MENA region over recent years, although you see on the right-hand side there that spike, again, largely in this instance due to the attack in Israel. But perhaps most worrying is this trend, this blue line that we see. Again, sub-Saharan Africa and the significant and gradual increase in measures of terrorism that we have seen in that particular region. And in South Asia, we've seen this ongoing improvement over time. Mostly in this instance, we're referring to Afghanistan and Pakistan. So delving in a bit more specifically into the Sahel, and in particular Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, we see that they account very much for most instances of terrorism within the region. We have seen an increase in terrorism more broadly, but as you can see here, they account for a very large percentage of those attacks. And this is another comparison drawing in the Sahel again, and some of the countries most impacted by terrorism historically, in this case, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. All other countries are in gray, right down at the bottom. And, this kind of sort of suggests this perhaps underlying, level of terrorism that is somewhat endemic to humanity and to the world, similar to the rates of homicide that we would see, for example. Can we ever get below 2,500 people dying of terrorism in any individual year? Who knows? But as you can see here, considerable spikes across these countries, anywhere between 2010 to 2015, 2016. Significant improvement in a number of those countries. Iraq is perhaps the most significant, the darker yellow that you can see in the middle there. But then, of course, that significant increase in the Sahel region, which is the one at the top, the gray one, the dark gray that you see there. And the West, as you can see, largely unaffected overall, historically, at least quite an uptick in 2015, 2016. But as you can see, in terms of overall measures, very, very small, a very small sliver there. In the report, we delve into a bit more detail about the connection between organized crime and terrorism, specifically in the Sahel, although these are tendencies that we see sort of all over the world. Places like Colombia and Afghanistan come to mind, of course. We sort of delve into the multiple ways in which different terrorist organizations and organized crime organizations kind of sort of intermingle and coexist. Terrorist groups are more likely to engage directly in criminal activity than cooperate with organized crime. In terms of JNIM specifically, I think about overall 40% of their overall revenue comes from kidnapping and ransoming, for example. But we've seen significant impacts in the case of the Sahel in terms of increase in cattle theft, for example, and in relation to artisanal gold mining as well. So very much competing for territory and for resources to be able to sustain their revenue in perhaps ways that they haven't been able to do since 9/11. So in terms of the most active terrorist groups, I mentioned before that the Taliban is no longer classified, so is therefore no longer listed in this organization, although historically had been responsible for a lot of deaths. There is a fall in the number of active groups, and this is something that we would see pretty much looking at any year. So for the most part, terrorist groups don't last a whole lot of time. Within a period of 2 years, they're basically defunct or have alternatively merged into a larger group. The Global Terrorism Index is actually quite conservative when it comes to giving the number of attacks and the number of deaths. So, for example, just over 40% of the attacks that are registered are not attributed to a specific group. But we're able to use a variety of different methods, in this instance using machine learning, to be able to provide what we hope is a closer estimate to the true number of deaths over time. Again, this is very difficult to confirm, But what you can do is you can basically kind of look at what are the similar attacks that have happened in this location, who's responsible for those, what were the targets, what was the way in which the terrorist attack occurred. And as you can see here, the Islamic State, which is the most deadly organization worldwide, would have accounted for significantly more deaths. Also in the case of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually sort of birthed the Islamic State in many ways. So the Islamic State remains the deadliest group, although perhaps one of the things to mention here is, well, again, this kind of sort of downward trend in the dark blue. This is one that could be replicated year on year. So, for example, in this graph here, we took all of the terrorist groups that existed in 2007. So as you can see, the large majority of those either ceased to exist or ceased to be active by 2023. However, the Islamic State has increased its influence. It was severely affected after counterterrorism efforts in Iraq and Syria. In 2015, 2016, but has now gravitated towards sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel. In terms of al-Shabaab, we have seen it increasing slightly over time. As you can see, this is the one in red. Sorry, excuse me. Although there have been successful counterterrorism measures, which you can't entirely see here on the tail end of that line there. Perhaps worrying, and largely in relation to Burkina Faso, you see the rise of JNIM, an Al-Qaeda affiliate in the region here, and quite significantly so, essentially overtaking, in this instance, al-Shabaab, and on its way to overtake the Islamic State locally in this instance. So in relation to overall attacks in the West, if there is kind of sort of a mention of good news, I suppose this is it. Instances of terrorism are the lowest that they have been since 2007 in the West. And when we're referring to the West, largely we're talking about the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. We do see that political terrorism takes up the lion's share of the individual incidents and attacks that are occurring within that. I should remember the specific number, seven incidences, I might need to confirm that, and 16 deaths in the United States. In the United States this year, 1 incident and 1 death in Canada specifically. Most of the incidents in the United States related to right-wing tendencies. Now, lastly, to close, we do look whenever we can into the correlations that exist between terrorism and peace. One of the points that we make is that there are significant correlations between terrorism and conflict. 90% of terrorist attacks happen in countries that are in conflict, although it is true that there are a number of countries that are in conflict that don't necessarily have measures of terrorism there. All 3 of the Global Peace Index domains correlate with the Global Terrorism Index. There is a bit of variance between OECD or highly sort of economically developed countries and ones that are less so. So, for example, we do see that connection with conflict, internal conflict, is significantly higher in non-OECD countries. But, for example, in countries that are more highly developed economically or doing better economically, levels of militarization do correlate. So in that instance, from my perspective at least, there isn't a whole lot of difference. The only difference here is that one country has got war at home and the other one is involved in a war abroad. But again, it broadly speaks to this correlation between terrorism and conflict. In terms of positive peace, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, these are sort of some underlying socioeconomic and cultural and attitudinal metrics that IEP tracks and provides a measure of resilience globally. We do see, nonetheless, that across both OECD countries and non-OECD countries, a close correlation with what we call the acceptance of the rights of others pillar. So largely related to socioeconomic exclusion and group grievances. These are things that track across all of these instances as it pertains to correlations with terrorism. Lastly, of course, the report is freely available to everyone online, including an interactive map like the one that you will see here, enabling you to click on any country of your choice. Nick, if you would be kind enough to add that particular link into the chat, that would be fantastic. very quickly, of course, delighted to respond to any questions that you may have. Looking forward to speaking, to hearing from the speakers. I'm talking from Washington, D.C. We do have offices all over the world. And of course, if you'd like to follow the work of IEP and other instances as well, we have plenty more reports and products out there for you to take advantage of. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. That was a lot of data that we need to unpack because I think I even have a lot of questions. But I'm going to first, we're going to go to our two next speakers, and then we'll take questions because I know there's going to be tons. All right, so are we starting with Dr. Benjamin Pohl, the head of the Climate Diplomacy and Security Program at Adelphi? So please, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this data.
Yeah.
You're
Can you
on.
hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me. And it was it is indeed was a really interesting presentation. Lots of data. I thought that for my part, I wouldn't pile more data on this, but rather add a little bit on the linkages between terrorism and
Yeah.
and the climate and environmental crisis that we are facing, and maybe more by way of sort of the narratives that we need to be cognizant of. So we, and I think that we know that there's climate vulnerability and fragility, and the places where we have a strong incident of terrorism, that they overlap very strongly, and that is probably not coincidental, even though the causal factors are hard to disentangle. And I think the really interesting and important aspects here are the interaction effects between environmental degradation, climate crisis, and then fragility. And but the problem is that, differently from the sort of global level climate change, they are very context specific. Those instances of fragility. So if we look at the Lake Chad Basin, which is one of the areas we did a big research report on, trying to put together an analysis of the drivers of environmental change and of fragility. Again, it's very much affected by both climate vulnerability and fragility, but it's not simply a question of resource scarcity in the way that is sometimes presented, although that obviously plays a role, but it's very strongly conditioned by governance factors. Obviously won't come as a surprise to anyone in this meeting here. This has at times led to a debate on what is more important. Is it climate change or governments? Which I don't think is very helpful for policy. And anyway, in many ways, you could argue that climate change is obviously also a governance failure. But because environmental change is expressed through livelihood challenges, which then feed into governance challenges, it's about understanding how exactly these interaction effect works. And so, coming back to Lake Chad Basin, we identified 4 impact pathways, which I think are they are specific to Lake Chad, but they probably play a role in many of the other areas that Michael has been talking about. And the first one is sort of the undermining of livelihoods that takes place by climate and conflict, and which has a self-perpetuating role, or can play such a self-perpetuating role in a sort of a vicious circle. So once we have, like in the Lake Chad Basin, the conflict that we have has very much undermined the adaptive capacity of the communities to climate change. So what we've had in the past was obviously a already resource scarce environment, but where people would shift between livelihoods, between fishing, pastoralism, agriculture, transboundary cattle trading, in a way that that made them more resilient to a drought or flooding or the vagaries of climatic change. But with a large scale displacement of people and with a a lot of restrictions on people's movement from the military side, but of course also from the insurgency side. Many of these livelihoods have been undermined in the sense that people cannot shift their life, cannot go to the other livelihood anymore because they can't move there, or they don't have the access to the resources. And that then leads to the second one, which is in fact an increased competition over natural resources, because there's less land that is being made available for livelihoods, but also because the sort of the land management and conflict resolution mechanisms have been undermined. And the point here is that one of the first things that both the insurgents but also the militaries did is that they targeted the leaders, the traditional leaders of groups in the area, and they were either killed, or they were co-opted, or they were displaced, or they were just shown to be powerless. So right, the traditional societal structures have been totally undermined. So which means there's no one there anymore if there is competition over land, if there is competition over who gets what and how things are being distributed. People are left to their own devices, which of course heightens the likelihood that this escalates into violence. So that's the second impact pathway. And then of course you have a risk of recruitment and retention in armed opposition groups, so that many of the people that were interviewed by our researchers said they weren't in it for ideological reasons. It was two things. It was one, it was a question of livelihood. So if if you're a fisherman in the Lake Chad, and then the military tells you can't fish anymore, you can't sell your fish because that's terror finance, because the armed opposition groups draw from the people living on the islands in the lake, in the sense of recruiting from them, and therefore it's seen as a supportive of terrorism. And then what's your choice, right? You have that this was your main livelihood, and the one alternative that you have is to join these groups, and you do that for material reasons, but also there's of course an identity draw here, because if the state is basically denying you your livelihood and your identity as a fisher or pepper farmer or whatever it is, obviously that is something that people are not happy about, and that they will rebel against, and that will give them some form of ideological reason to join the other side, right? And then there's a fourth pathway, and it's related to the way that these counterinsurgencies are being fought, right? And that they're heavily militarized, that there's a very strong focus on the kinetic side, and on the denying the other side the resources they need, or that they think they need to continue fighting, but which has in the end, very often, and I think that's not just in Lake Chad Basin, but in many of the conflicts that Michael was talking about, that ends up actually being a very powerful recruitment tool for armed opposition groups and terrorists, because the only way that the state is seen and is becoming active as a state is as an oppressor. Right. So we had people interviewed for the study who said that before the conflict, they didn't know which country they lived in. And that was simply because they've never, ever seen anyone from the government. There's no school, no hospital, no customs, no whatever. And now we have the government is present in the form of military and police, but they see themselves as being in enemy territory, and they behave like this, and that of course means that people are being even more alienated, and that is, I think, one of the reasons why so many of these conflicts have proven so hard to resolve, or even to mitigate. And I'll stop here. for the moment, and but happy to elaborate further.
Okay, so thank you. You pulled out some of the key pieces that what AFP talks about in our policy work, that conflict and climate change are compounding each other. So this is really critical, looking at this data, and also the fact that 90% of terrorist attacks, violent extremism attacks, are happening in countries experience conflict. So I actually want to dig, that's one of the things I want to dig down in, because we feel very strongly, and the data shows that conflict, violent extremism and terrorism are just symptoms of conflict factors. It's one of the ways that conflict is expressed. So, so that I think are key things to kind of link this through. Now moving towards Dr. Bakri Samba, and the regional director at the Timbuktu Institute, really critical because of all the data that was highlighted about the Sahel. Really important. I was looking at the numbers with Niger being one of those top 5 countries, and the importance of coastal West Africa in terms of prevention under the Global Fragility Act. I know when that region was selected, a lot of people scratched their head and were like, that's weird. This is exactly why, because you're seeing things from the Sahel and Burkina Faso and coastal West Africa with those numbers going up. I also want to say in Mali, what we saw was a massive pullout in terms of programming, security, which is pretty easy to see the correlation with attacks going up in Mali specifically. So, I mean, these are just some of the things to keep in mind that I've been going through as I've been listening to this incredible data, and why coastal West Africa, the region, is so critical under the Global Fragility Act because of the prevention piece of it, as we're starting to see these numbers go up. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much for your invitation to take part in this discussion following the publishing of this new index. It was really insightful to see what is now the new status of West Africa and the Sahel as a major epicenter of terrorism. She said something which was raised in former reports, but now we see that this region is really at the heart of this issue of terrorism. Because I think that we need to awareness to make the population and government aware about this phenomenon, because until now people are thinking that terrorism is something imported, and even in the way of tackling terrorism, for many governments, they explain or that they have to settle strategies that focus on defending the territory, defending the border security management, forgetting that it is now an internal phenomenon. This is a very important point we have to put in mind if you want to be in the same page with local government in the Sahel and the major information we have. The second point, which is very important to raise also in order to have the same understanding of this trend, is that counterterrorism is suffering or has suffered a lot from this and misinformation, from conspiracy theories, from also the policies that have been implemented by international partners in at some point that people, it is very difficult in the continent to convince people that terrorism is a reality. It is a very important point we have to put in mind. And this situation is due to the failure of security approach within the European Union and France in the Sahel, and also recently within the coup d'etat we have in the three main country of the Central Sahel, like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. If you don't take into account this element and this factor, we will never ever understand why the counterterrorism is suffering from this all element I have mentioned. The other thing also is, I think that if you see the figures, if we which clearly demonstrate that Africa now is the new hotspot of terrorism, as we can see. It is also the debate we can have, experts from the north and the south, about the role and the place of ideology. I see that since we see that people try always to explain that the ideological dimension is not very important for this phenomenon. And in the meantime, we see that among the strategies settled now here or developed in some countries, we see that counter-narrative, mobilization of religious leaders is something very important. I can maybe do not agree with this approach which want to demonstrate that ideology is not important. I remain very critical about this approach because
We lost him. Okay. I think
That wasn't censorship, by the way.
Yeah,
That wasn't
I
okay.
I think the internet. I think the internet went down. All right. Let's move to questions and we'll see if we can get him back. You might want to send him a note. Nick, thank you so much. All right, so let's open this up to questions. One, and I'll take a couple and then we'll
yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, you're back.
Yes.
So do you want to give us your, I don't know exactly where we lost you, but do you want to give us some of your final comments?
Yes, my final comment. The other thing also is how to specify what is the origin of terrorism. Like here you have political. What do you call, for example, political is something it's not very clear because inside political you have ideology. How can you separate between political and ideology? And my last point is I think that we need to revise all this old paradigm, which not makes sense, for example, in the Sahelian region, or for example, in the situation of Mali, when we see that the violence is more and more community violence, like the new situation with the Fulani in northern Benin, in northern Togo, and in Burkina Faso. If we do not include this new element in our analysis, we will continue to push our government to focus on security approach, which will have as a result to aggravate the situation in the region with very security approach strategies, and also forgetting the community dimension of tackling violent extremism, which is the source. Because until now, the effort must be done to explain to our state in West Africa that they have to make a difference between countering violent extremism and countering terrorism. Countering violent terrorism means to eliminate the target. Unfortunately, the target can regenerate if the root causes have not disappeared. So we need a mixed approach. We need security, but we need a community approach in order to give chance and to give the dignity of solution to our indigenous resources and solution. And we cannot harmonize the counterterrorism as we are trying to do now. That I think that we have to learn from the experiences of the communities in terms of building resilience and valorize these indigenous strategy in order to have counterterrorism that take into account the diversity of the approach, but also the possibility of some societies to reinvent counterterrorism and to go out all this this frame concerns in the north and impose it in the south to be in a way that we can co-construct the solution in order to tackle terrorism in a very efficient way. Thank you.
Ted, thank you. You raised two really important points. There is a security element to this, but also recognizing when we're talking about drivers of violent extremism and conflict, security forces, security personnel abuses are high up in terms of driving these issues in human rights abuses, for example.
In Mali,
especially in Mali. It's actually when you were talking about Uganda, why that blip is coming up. I mean, it's one of the issues there as well. So I think that that's really important. There is a security element of but you also have to address the drivers. So, even here in the United States, for example, our government security forces, when I say, I'm talking more intelligence and police, thwarted the attack on the electrical grid system in Baltimore, for example. We recognize that there is a security component that has to be there. However, you can go to the extreme, like you're talking about, where they can also be the cause of violent extremism. So that I think we're not naive enough to not understand that there isn't a security component to this, but you have to get at the what's causing the conflict. Okay, so those were two really important points. One thing I wanted to ask you, and then we'll take other questions as well, is what do you define as conflict, a conflict country? So for example, you noted that violent extremism or terrorism attacks, there were attacks in the United States. Do you constitute the US as fragile, conflict affected? Do they fall into that 90% or do they fall into that 10%? Is one question. You don't have to answer it just yet because I want to get to other questions, but keep that one in mind. Questions in the room, questions online. Nick, you're seeing online, so okay, so why don't you get the ones online?
So
a couple.
I can pose two from online, and then maybe we could go into, because that's three, Michael, and we can toss around also the other panelists as well. But we had a question from Marine Farouk, who's at Counterpart International, member of AFP, asking, when you were doing your analysis, were there efforts to disaggregate the data by gender to get kind of a more full perspective of how terrorist violence is playing out in these countries? We had a really interesting question from Lisa Chandler.
Well, wait, gender, meaning the disaggregate who the violent extremists are?
And how people are impacted, right?
Okay.
So the victims of these
who
attacks.
And victims,
Yes.
Okay.
And then we had a very interesting question from Lisa Chandler, who's a metaverse creator. She says, the metaverse is a global blockchain-focused community. Are there public suppression lists of blockchain accounts associated with terrorism? Ideally, they would exist for each chain. So I think it gets to the question of illicit financing funds for terrorist groups, right? And you talked about in the report how illicit wildlife trade, for example, is starting to take up an increasing share. I will say, it's a very fascinating book by Zeke Fo on crypto called Number Go Up. Came out in the fall. Highly recommend it. I feel like the main takeaway of the book was crypto has no real world applications except for funding human trafficking and terrorism and drugs and illicit crimes. So just to pose that to you, I don't know, maybe if you want to take a chance to look kind of maybe share a bit more on your research into the financial flows of these groups. So that was a lot.
So who's in that 90% conflict? Like is a country like the United States involved in that, or are they part of the 10%?
Right.
The disaggregating gender of the who and the victims, and then the illicit financing question.
So in relation to the first, perhaps one of the things to clarify is that there are a number of countries around the world that are in conflict that don't necessarily have high measures of terrorism, but the opposite is not necessarily true. So we call it a one-sided relationship, right? Where we do see, on the other hand, that when terrorism exists, it's usually in a conflict scenario. And I think you gave the best sort of description of that, Liz, which is, in many cases, it's a tactic of war, in many instances. So there is always a very kind of sort of gray line as it pertains to the United States specifically. I mean, it's a loaded question. So for example, in the Global Peace Index, we look at peace through 3 different domains. There is an ongoing conflict domain, which speaks largely to internal organized conflict, large wars, right? So of course, there's a number of countries around the world. Let's say Myanmar would be an example of that, in which we've also seen a significant increase in terrorism. Well, actually, there's been a decrease, but the reason behind that is because that has actually since blown out into essentially what is a full-scale war, right? Essentially. So another example of that. The US performs relatively poorly on the militarization domain and also certain measures related to safety and security. So it wouldn't perhaps be classified as one of those countries with high levels of conflict, but of course the broader definition of peacefulness is different.
Okay, so let me ask this question in a different way.
Okay.
So then that 10%, right? And if the
What's
US.
the 10%?
Oh, because you said
Oh, right.
90% of violent extremism is talking
Yeah,
about
it would
reprobation.
be in this instance, say the United States, for example.
Would be in that 10% or
But
90%?
in all likelihood, it would be
in that 10%.
That's
Okay,
correct. Or
so-
a European country, or perhaps, yes.
Okay, so just out of curiosity, does Uganda fall in that 10% or 90%?
So
Because it's fragile.
yes, it probably would.
Which one, 10 or 90?
It would you're really putting me on the spot. So historically, Uganda doesn't have a large history of terrorism.
Okay.
I think over the last 10 years since we've been counting it, perhaps we're talking about 3 or 4 events spread throughout there with relatively few deaths. So in the case of Uganda, it was truly exceptional. I believe it was 38 people or so who actually died from a single attack in the school in Uganda. So as to whether it's in the 10% or
Okay,
not,
I'm just, okay, I didn't.
yeah, I probably need to tune up
Okay,
on some of
it's
the
okay.
other measures.
Sorry, I was just curious in terms of what constitutes that, what's that 90 or 10% and okay.
So I mean, just to clarify even further, if it's helpful at all. So one of the key measures that we track inside the Global Peace Index is the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. These are battle deaths, and it's usually sort of over 25 deaths in the instance of a kind of sort of full-on battle, usually between a state actor and a non-state actor. So that would be the distinct measure of conflict that we would track for that.
So I'm just going to take this one step further then and say, when we start using the data 90-10, we also need to be careful to say in that 10, there are countries that are fragile or sliding on that fragility side, right? So let's say it would be Uganda or the United States, for example. We just need to clear, I'm just trying to make the case for, it's not like those 10% are, everything's good and happy there.
No, by no
Yeah,
means,
okay. All
by
right,
no
that's it.
means. Yeah,
All right,
no,
perfect.
and I hope that we didn't make that.
No.
hope that
I
we
just
didn't make
wanted,
that case.
no. I just wanted to make
Yeah.
that clear so we
Yeah.
can say that. Okay, disaggregated gender between who and victims.
No. So the short answer is no. I mean, all measures of terrorism are really underreported around the world, as are many other instances of violence across the world. So the sources that we use primarily come from local news reports. And it's hard enough to be able to identify how many people died and potentially the terrorist group who perpetrated it. So the disaggregation by gender is more difficult. When we're looking at it globally like this, of course, you could go into, do a particular case study for a particular attack and perhaps gain some more insight there.
Okay, and then the illicit financing.
So as it pertains to blockchain, I'm sorry, I don't know.
Do you want to tell us what you want to tell everybody what blockchain is or somebody? Okay.
But yeah.
I mean, overall, with regards to financing, and we do sort of jump into this in the report, although I'm perhaps not the best person to talk about it. I mean, we perhaps report on sort of more traditional forms of financing. I'm sure there are many instances already in which terrorist organizations are adopting, phishing attacks and scam emails, perhaps in pretty much the whole of society is. So we do expect that terrorist organizations are leveraging new technologies in the same way that everyone is more broadly, including bad and good state actors. But yeah, as it pertains to the details, most of our report focuses on some of the more traditional, for lack of a better word, kidnapping, ransom, drug trafficking, cattle rustling in the case of the Sahel, for example.
Okay, and Dr. Samba, am I saying your name correctly?
Yes, I would like to just to add in your index sometime and a lot of index sometime we focus a lot on the attacks and the casualties. And the most important work we have to do is before. How do we analyze and how can we put in mind all the process before the attacks and how they what are their strategy to have fuel, to have money, to use trafficking. I think that if we just focus on the attacks and the number of casualty, also our vision of the phenomenon will be relatively very partial. So we have to take it down. The other point is, I think that we continue to talk about just the Sahel, and in my perception, but perhaps it falls. We neglect to take into account the West Africa as a whole. And if I can say something, is the most important strategical mistake we have done these last 10 years. It was to extract the Central Sahel from the rest of West Africa, ignoring that there is a socio-cultural continuum and now we are obliged to talk about spillover. So if in the past we have taken into account the reality that the Central Sahel is not to be extracted from the whole West Africa, we were not today talking about spillover. We have similar realities in West Africa, and we have to revise this kind of paradigm. I know that it was something heritated from the G5 Sahel when we isolate these countries, and more the reality is quietly different, and we have to take into account the socio-cultural continuum between Central Sahel and the rest of West Africa. You see the situation in northern Benin, the situation in northern Togo, the situation in Cote d'Ivoire are part of the situation of now in Niger and Burkina Faso. So we have to more and more integrate in our analysis to see West Africa as a whole in order to better understand the root causes and in the meantime, the interdependence of these countries.
So I couldn't agree with you more. And you're talking about looking at what we've learned. I'm going to put Shazia on the spot here. She's with AFP. And she is leading our work on violent extremism. There's a big research that's coming out that we've been doing. Are there any things you want to mention quickly on, some of the key learnings?
Yeah. And I mean,
I know I put her on the spot. So.
Yes. This is not rehearsed at all. But I mean, one very interesting work coming out, and I'm curious to dig further into the findings from the GDI. But I also think, our research is focused very predominantly on violent extremism. And so that kind of broadens that definition just a little bit from conventional terrorism. So that's our research is focused on programming that's meant to prevent and counter violent extremism. And what is the evidence of what we've learned from this? And I think I'm really happy for the question on gender, because we saw a lot of research coming out that the role of women, one, in perpetrating violent extremism, but also in reintegration, rehabilitation, prevention, was so under-researched, but also so very important. And so while there isn't enough data, there's even so much less data on, who the actors are, what are the target audiences, what is the makeup of that? Because without a better understanding on that, we're kind of just shooting in the dark a little bit and going round and round in vicious circles, right? So I was so happy that question came up. And I also do wonder, Michael, if there is any data, you do capture data on violent extremist organizations or terrorist organizations. I wonder if, specific like Al-Qaeda or Jinn or Al-Shabaab, like if there is any information on, the makeup of those organizations and any gender disaggregation on that line. But also one related, not related, but very key finding that we found in terms of what works and what does not work, especially with respect to prevention or de-radicalization and disengagement. There's been so much focus and emphasis on psychological factors. And if you are to address, drivers of terrorism, drivers of extremism, drivers of conflict, with the lens of psychological factors, there is actually a really big danger of doing harm than good, because there were some studies that showed that if you were to address these psychological factors and, add to the good social standing of individuals in these settings, it does increase narcissism levels, and that does make you more susceptible to extremist ideology, terrorist ideology. So while everyone wants to do it and everyone's figuring out different ways to do it, there is actually potential of doing massive harm over there if not done correctly and if you're not analyzing the entire landscape holistically. So that's just a few things out there.
That was great, Bruno.
Good job, Sarah. So looking forward to this data that's coming out. I know just everyone keeps going to the so what? So what do we do about it? So I just wanted to let everybody know that that is coming out. And part of this research came about going back into 2017. We were looking at theories of change around violent extremism. And so many things of what people say, we have no data to back it up, that it's even working, or it might actually be harmful if not done well. So this is taking this research further. But sure.
I would love to pose the gender question to Benjamin, if that's okay. And I'm curious, in your research in the Lake Chad region and beyond, what you've seen is the interplay of kind of climate or environmental factors, terrorism, and then the different roles of men and women in society, and how it could influence how people fall into these groups, how they take part in them, and then also the impacts of violent extremism and terrorism as well. So not to put you on the spot, Benjamin, but I thought, I don't know if you have any thoughts to share there.
Sure. Sure, happy to. Yes, we always in our research, integrate a gender analysis, and it comes out very strongly in these cases. I mean, there is a very strong gender dynamics in terms of what how people are targeted and how we often think gender and then we just think of it as a shortcut for talking about women, but in this case it's also men. They're very much targeted and targeted for being killed, right? That's a risk. That's a very unpleasant risk you run into, and of course you also have a very very strong gender dynamics with displacement camps, which are 80-90% women, children, and which had played a negative role at least at the outset in terms of the conflict cycle, because initially when the humanitarian relief effort was very much underfunded in the region before the abduction of these 300 school girls took place, and then there was a lot of media attention. What happened was that people, the only thing they received for some food in these camps, and so because they didn't get any fuel, what they did was they started to collect firewood in ever-created distance around the camps, and not only did this expose them to a lot of violence, but it also meant that the local climate was there was a strong environmental degradation, because the way sort of the environment works there is that you have the monsoon that hits the coast, and then water comes up and it goes further inland, but it depends on the vegetation for this. And so there was also a massive environmental destruction going on as a result of the conflict dynamics and the sort of the wrong the wrong things in the response. But yeah, there's gender dynamics also in terms of what roles are sort of what roles men are expected to play, and if these are not these relate, for example, to certain agricultural roles, and if they cannot fulfill them because of the circumstances, then sort of their male identity is very much undermined. And again, it might be another push factor into sort of making up for this by either leaving and looking for work elsewhere, or by being drawn into the wrong groups. But there's also, I mean, just sort of as a, you know, since we were discussing what were the biggest mistakes, I very much agree with the fact that, you know, trying to get keep the Sahel apart from West Africa is one, but I think there's an even bigger one, which I think is the whole framing of this as, you know, initially as a global war on terror, and that war framing, I think, was it was a terrible mistake, because of course there is a security dimension in fighting this, but by defining it as a war and the response thereby as sort of military led is something that has, you know, of course it's much less emphasized now, but it's still 20 years later, it's playing out with very bad consequences, because it's not seen primarily as a state building, peace building, etc. exercise, but as a, you know, an effort that inherently is military led. So that was just my
Thank
my
you,
50
Benjamin.
cents triggered.
Thank you,
If
Benjamin.
I could just quickly, Dr. Sambe does have to leave. He has to catch some transport. So before you drop, I just want to say a big thank you to him. We'll continue the Q&A segment, but thank you so much
Thank
for your
you.
time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there questions in the room? Yeah?
Right on that. Just a few, I'm a clinical and political psychologist. I have a chapter on psychology of terrorism. Just a brief thing about gender, that also gender split cultures have more violence when the, you know, gender roles are more stereotypic, and child rearing practices and punishment and patriarchal authoritarian systems. But terrorism is also a dynamic of asymmetrical power dynamics. So a few things. One is the role of humiliation, which is conducive to violence. The other thing is needs theory, that people would prefer to get their needs met by decent means. So often these groups like try other nonviolent, you know, petitions, requests, and the more you're denied that you have to resort to more extreme methods. And I think most terrorist attacks are predictable and preventable. I predicted 9/11. I mean, I could sort of feel that it was going to come back to us. And also, like, what's going on in Gaza was completely preventable and predictable and escalation. So
Yeah, so I
that's
think
a-
that, I mean, within the research going back, I mean, you can go back to the research that was done by Lynn Carter and USA 2012, 2013, 14, something like that. You know, really the cause in terms of human rights abuses, humiliation, security sector, and Mari Fitzstuff also talks about, and this plays into Shah's, your comments about building the kind of the narcissism. You know, it's better to be a mujahideen with a cause, right, than a petty criminal. That's her line in terms of why people are attracted to it. So I think that that's really important in understanding what that brain science is telling us, and are we doing things that are wrong? So I think that's really important. Are there other questions in terms of looking at this data that people want? I mean, we have Michael here. Are there, you know, burning questions that people want to understand the data a little bit more? Or online?
So we had a question online asking about have you seen any instances where terrorist organizations used AI technology to further their agenda? I think what we've seen a lot so far, data that we see is repressive states are using it, for example, to surveil certain parts of the population. You do see a lot of bad actors using it to create disinformation on a wide scale. And I know this is probably outside the scope of your report, but I'm curious if you've seen any developments there.
We haven't seen enough data around this to be able to actually kind of sort of form any core insights. So, we suspect more broadly that it's being used by terrorist organizations in the same way that it's being used by everyone else, but we don't have any data on the subject.
Yeah, because they've done very well in terms of the disinformation and the online.
So, Michael, let me pull you away from your data because I'm sure they can't answer this, so we won't record this part of it. Before we started, we were talking about pandemics and public health related issues. And as I heard Diane talk about humiliation and things like that, I'm wondering how deep your data allow you to go in exploring causation of these events, and if they don't, which I suspect they don't, what kind of data would you need to gather if someone gave you $100 million to do the research? So I think you need 100 actually.
No, but I think your question is really good, because
It
just
is?
pulling out the central Sahel is now the epicenter of violent extremism, accounting for over half of all deaths from terrorism. And the US accounted for 76 of terrorism-related deaths in Western democracies.
No.
No, that's not true? That's not true?
76 deaths in the United States?
No, 76%.
Oh, okay, yes.
Okay, so 76%.
But it's a small number.
But it's a small number, but, so what do you think is pushing that from your research in the US and from the Central Sahel?
Well, I've been given permission to expand perhaps
Yeah.
beyond the brief of
Yes.
IEP, but thankfully it's relatively aligned. I mean, going back to your comments as well as Dr. Sanders and Benjamin's as well, which I think provided sort of a fantastic connection and a description of how that alienation then kind of sort of progresses down a path that leads to extremism and terrorist acts. And perhaps if I can, make reference to some of the work that we've done around this is obviously sort of looking at the correlations that exist between terrorist incidents and positive peace, these underlying resilience metrics. Now, again, across countries, the thing that tracks most solidly is this acceptance of the rights of others.
Wait, say that again?
The
Acceptance of rights of others. So if you have that, it goes down.
Well, I mean, as it pertains, so that is one of the key, and well, this brings me to a broader point also raised by Dr. Sembe as well. So the short answer is yes, that is one of the elements that we see strongly correlates across all sort of levels of socioeconomic development across the world, right? This element related to socioeconomic inclusion and the reduction of group grievances. And I think the ideological perspective comes into there, but the basic necessities, education, healthcare, etc., come into play as well at various stages. So that particular element, yes, I couldn't agree more with everybody in the room, that is absolutely key, and we see that through our research as well. But interestingly, no, it's not the single thing, and this is why when we talk about positive peace, we always talk about sort of these 8 pillars and the fact that there's many different aspects that come into play. Specifically, when it comes to, the security component, right? We tend to see in countries that are in conflict or in a situation of instability or post-conflict, that the pillars of well-functioning government, low levels of corruption are absolutely key very early on, right? So essentially the rule of law in many respects. Too often, though, the tendency continues to be, and the unfortunate consequence is that people who are really good at applying rule of law or making sure that it exists are not necessarily the greatest people to run the country long term, for lack of a better word, right? So there's this disconnect between inclusive socioeconomic development and rule of law. So that's a particular area where we feel that we can obviously continue to progress.
But Michael, I kind of raised the question because at our Rotary Peace Conference last weekend that Liz didn't go to because she was doing yoga in Mexico. It was an excuse.
Because my bag didn't let me, but
It was an excused absence. One of the things that the Rotarians in the room kept talking about, and my political science methodologist brain kept saying, no, it's more complicated, is the sense that if we were able to address those 8 pillars, then much of the underlying support that could be tapped into for terrorism would not evaporate, but would decline. And I'm wondering if you thought about how those parts of your institutional work connect and how you'd even answer those questions.
I mean, sorry, go ahead, please.
Okay.
And I only wanted to add to that because it's something on my mind as well. So AFP did some research a while ago on the state of social cohesion and democracy in the US. And this was looking at conflict experts and kind of getting their perceptions on what the state of democracy and social cohesion was in the US. And how we approached it was these pressure points and resilience factors. And so for pressure points, we saw, very high toxic polarization, very low trust within political parties, across political parties. However, we did see what we call resiliency factors that had very high trust in local government structures. So that's kind of, there's high pressure points we need to focus on to build cohesion, to better our democracy. And then there's
What's
and-
working?
Yeah, and then there's resiliency factors that we could leverage to address these high pressure points. So with that angle and what Chip was mentioning, I'm wondering how your 8 pillars, the top 5, 10 countries that you're seeing really high terrorism trends, what in your peace pillars for those countries we could use as leverage points to kind of address these areas.
And the data is showing 2 top predictors. This goes to exactly what you were just saying. 2 top predictors of a country moving into conflict is that their government is moving to an anocracy, which goes to your rule of law issue, right? It gets, and ideology. So people are using they're moving more around an ideology. And so that goes to your issue on, group grievances as well. Over to you. We're throwing massive questions at you on this data. And so, yeah.
So, I mean, we try and kind of sort of approach this statistically whenever we can. We try and sort of try and avoid falling into sort of a moral or a philosophical trap, although thankfully the data kind of sort of supports a lot of the things that we would consider to be, intuitive in many ways. So we look at it from the perspective of, okay, well, what are the particular violence metrics that we can track, right? And then how do those correlate with a variety of other socioeconomic measures? And it very much confirms the work of Alliance for Peacebuilding, the critical work that you're doing. So the United States already performs quite badly in something like the Global Peace Index. It performs much better historically when it comes to positive peace measures. There's indicators of resilience, but that has been deteriorating now for 15 years. And I think that we're beginning to see kind of the consequence of that. When it comes to the countries that are more in conflict, again, we do see that although these 8 pillars are absolutely critical at these various stages of stabilization, well-functioning government, low levels of corruption, rule of law are critical at these kind of sort of early stages. So in terms of the overall, and also the counterterrorism efforts, right, those surgical ones, those high intensity ones are successful, right, as we would see, for example, in Iraq right now. Now, is that an indication that we're seeing increased levels of stability in the country if we lift up the hood? No, absolutely not. And in all likelihood, ISIS is just sort of biding its time for the US to pull out, and then we'll see a blow up in Iraq, right? That's conjecture on my part. It's just an example. But I think that one of the areas where Alliance for Peacebuilding and all of us as partners can continue to be very tuned is, how number one do we sort of put that in place, not falling into the trap, as Dr. Sambe mentioned, to think that somehow we are necessarily the people to provide the right recommendations there. How can we support early stabilization, but critically, how can we support that transition then to sort of safer, addressing of other potential grievances over time?
Absolutely. Yeah. So 3 brief things. One is, you pressed the green.
Fairbairn was a child analyst, and he said people, I think this is more a guy thing, would rather be bad than weak. And Famak Vulcan said people would rather die physically than psychologically. And also, I just want to invoke the memory of Johan Galtung, who died 2 weeks ago, my mentor and dear friend. So the transcend method that you need to identify, basic human needs, legitimate goals, and just grievances and find ways of, illegitimate goals and basic human needs also include dignity, identity, and sovereignty.
Yeah, that's some of the main research around dignity,
Mhm.
human rights abuses, what drives
Mhm.
violence and conflict. All right, we're getting towards the end of time. Any other final thoughts? I think we're going to be pulling out some of the main points that we'll be putting in our talking points. That is really critical in terms of, I think, really coming out is the Central Sahel issue. And understanding that while extremist attacks have been going down, they're deadlier. And that part of the reason why this drop is really due to, I think, Afghanistan, correct? Would you say, are those statements correct, or if I'm?
Sorry, I'm distracted by a message in the chat from Mark Summers, the last
Oh, okay.
chat that came in.
All right, Mark's always a great question. What is Mark saying?
So he basically said,
I'm sure he's talking about youth.
well, he's talking about actually Afghanistan.
Oh,
that
okay.
They're no longer, it's not part of the top ranking for countries for terrorism because the Taliban
Right.
now runs the state of Afghanistan. In other words, they won. I'm reading this.
Yeah.
The message seems to be the terror group is steadfast and resilient. They can take over states. It seems to be the message that JNIM states the Sahel, the rising power, counterterrorist approaches seem only to have expanded their influence. The situation in West Africa seems connected to the example of Afghanistan, which is really concerning. So not really a question, more.
But it's a really good point.
Comment, a good point. And I don't know, what do you make of that?
I think it's spot on. I think it's spot on. I mean, I think that's the ongoing danger, the ongoing challenge, and it kind of sort of highlights the ground, a lot of these organizations have a lot of support locally, and a lot of organizations are biding their time, and a lot of organizations, legitimately or not, I mean, have grievances that are historical, that are just growing over time. So I definitely think that is, I mean, the fact that, that the peace agreement in Afghanistan didn't actually, involve like a number of key parties, essentially. I mean, that was already, didn't bode particularly well. So long story short, yes, I think that is a core consideration and a key danger throughout.
And also one other point, the Colombia issue. That's really, I mean, this is something to go back and look at where the peace agreement is. If you're seeing attacks increase with the FARC, for example.
Correct, and I mean, just to go to the war in Gaza. I mean, the fact that any terrorist organization, militant organization, call it what you will, can essentially dissolve into the general population, and that happens throughout. In the case of Colombia, people walk back up to the jungle and never to be seen again, and so yeah, it's distinctly challenging.
Okay. Well, there's lots of good data in there. Once again, we're grateful for the work at IUP and then for your dissemination to make sure that it gets out and gets used. We are grateful for you and your partnership. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.